On the day my company turned 10, I arrived early, earlier than usual, even for me. I had this quiet hope. Maybe someone would remember. A small cake, a laugh, a toast. Something. After all, I'd given this place more than a decade, more than effort. I gave it my name, my sleep, my family, my blood, in every sense of that word. I walked through the lobby like I always had, nodding at security. But even their usual, "Good morning, sir," felt off, shorter, colder, like they weren't sure how to greet me anymore. Then I saw it, the glass door that led to the boardroom. My name had always been there, etched beside the logo. Founded by Daniel Reed. Only now it wasn't. Gone. Wiped clean. Just a dull smudge in the light. At first I paused, staring like a man who's seen a ghost where his reflection should be. Was it being replaced, cleaned, rebranded? But no one said a word. Then I heard it. Laughter. Behind the boardroom glass. Voices. Slides clicking. Terms like pivot, scale up, future ready. I walked closer. Through the frosted glass, I saw outlines. All the key execs, all the partners, every chair filled. Except mine. I checked my phone. No invite, no email, not even a text. So I just stood there, hand on the door I used to open first, like a stranger at his own house party, listening to people inside complain about the host. I turned away before anyone saw me. Back at my office, still labeled founder, I sat in the dark. No calls, no flowers, no messages. Just the ticking of the old wall clock I brought from my garage 10 years ago when this company was just an idea and a sketch pad. Then around noon, my assistant walked in, a sweet girl, 23, fresh from grad school, holding a tiny bag. "Happy birthday, Mr. Reed," she said with a small smile. That was it. No team message, no department heads. Just a girl who hadn't learned yet how people move on from the ones who built their ladder. I thanked her, genuinely. But as she walked out, my phone buzzed. An email accidentally forwarded by a junior staffer. Meeting notes, unedited transcript. I shouldn't have opened it. But I did. "We need to be honest," someone had said. "Daniel doesn't get the market anymore. His methods are slow. He overanalyzes. He thinks loyalty still matters. That's not how the game works today. We have to start fresh. New leadership. Someone who sees where the world is going." And then Liam's voice. Liam, my first hire. A man I'd once paid out of pocket just to keep him on during a cash flow crisis. He said, he built the company, sure, but now he's just in the way. I read it twice. Not because I didn't believe it, but because I did. I sat there, completely still, not angry, not even hurt. Just stunned. They didn't just forget me. They had erased me. From meetings, from memory, from meaning. And they did it on my birthday. That night, I didn't go home right away. I walked the city for hours. No destination, just moving so I wouldn't feel like I was falling. People passed me by, smiling into their phones, laughing with friends, holding hands. And I realized something. They thought I was done, that I had poured all I had into building the company. They forgot what every true builder knows. You never give everything. You keep the blueprint. And in that silence, as the city glowed gold and blue around me, I made a decision. Let them laugh behind the glass. I'll show them what legacy really looks like. I returned the next day, not because I wanted to, but because I wasn't raised to abandon what I'd built. Not like that. A part of me still believed. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe I was overthinking, reading into things that weren't there. But I wasn't wrong. The silence had changed. It wasn't just forgetfulness now. It was avoidance. I could feel it in the way people's eyes slid past me in the hallway, in the quick hush that followed when I walked by, smiles that didn't reach the eyes, heads bent deeper into phones as I approached. The warmth was gone, and in its place stood something colder, sharper, manufactured professionalism, thin, brittle politeness masking something rotting underneath. By the end of the week, I heard the whispers, not directly, never directly. I wasn't worth confrontation anymore. But the office walls were never soundproof enough to contain ambition. The younger managers, fresh out of accelerator programs and marketing conferences, thought they were inventing the future. They thought experience was just a hurdle to innovation. "He can just sit back with his shares," someone laughed once. "I mean, he is rich. Let him enjoy retirement." Let the next generation take it from here. And the worst one, he was great for what the company was, not for what it could be. That was the moment I understood the real danger. It wasn't that they disagreed with me, it was that they believed I no longer mattered. I had become a relic in their eyes. A framed photo on the wall, a story told at onboarding. They wanted to keep the parts of me that were useful, my name, my legacy, my equity, while quietly writing me out of the present, and eventually the future. And the whispers, they weren't just about me. They were becoming strategy. Teams were forming behind closed doors. New visions were emerging. People I once mentored were now positioning themselves as pioneers, as saviors, as if they had pulled the company out of its darkest years. Not me. Not the man who spent nights sleeping on the office couch during the recession, calling suppliers one by one, begging them for just one more week of trust. Not the man who sold his car to meet payroll twice. None of them had lived that part, but they were happy to build on its ruins. There was one meeting where I was still invited, probably out of obligation. I sat at the far end of the table. No one looked my way. I offered a thought, measured, precise, based on hard-won experience. They nodded, scribbled something, then shifted the conversation to something trendier, louder, flashier. Afterwards, no one walked with me to the elevator. And when the doors closed, I saw my own reflection, tired but not broken, diminished but still standing. They thought they were erasing me, but they didn't know who they were dealing with, because I wasn't built by compliments. I was forged in silence, in doubt, in being underestimated. Let them whisper. They were so busy planning their takeover, they never noticed the old lion still watching from the shadows. And they forgot one fatal truth. The foundation remembers the hands that laid it. Friends, let me pause for just a moment. If you're still with me, I'd love to know. Where are you listening from? Has anything like this ever happened to you? Being pushed aside, forgotten, even after giving your all? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story speaks to you, consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. It's a small action, but it truly helps us grow this channel and keep telling stories that matter. Now, let's continue. It didn't feel like betrayal at first. It felt quiet. Too quiet. When they removed me as CEO, they didn't shout. There were no slam doors, no ultimatums, just a motion, a vote, and a string of carefully polished sentences, each one designed to sound like a compliment while delivering a cut. They framed it as kindness, as a gracious transition, as a legacy-preserving move, as if I were an antique being placed gently on a shelf to be admired but never touched again. I watched the faces around the table as they voted. Some looked down. A few had the decency to avoid eye contact entirely, but most wore the same expression. Relief, as if a weight had been lifted, as if I had become the weight. They didn't want the man who had once saved the company from collapse. They wanted someone more camera-ready, sharper suits, shorter sentences, buzzwords and bottom lines, not someone who still believed relationships matter more than reach. When it was over, they handed me a single page to sign, a ceremonial gesture. I read the words, but none of them described me. Founder Emeritus, a name without a voice, a role without a purpose, a seat in the building, but not in the room. I signed it anyway, not because I accepted it, but because I understood the game. You don't win by holding the door closed. You win by building the next one. After the meeting, they offered a catered lunch in my honor. I didn't attend. I walked out of that glass tower in silence, the same way I walked in 10 years ago. Except now, the weight in my chest wasn't hope. It was heat. Slow, contained, but undeniable. The kind that doesn't fade. The kind that fuels. They thought they were doing what was best for the company. But the truth was simpler, colder. They were afraid of what I still represented. I was the reminder of how things used to be, of a time when trust mattered more than trends, when leadership wasn't about media coverage but showing up when no one else did, when you built something with calloused hands and sleepless nights, not just investor slides. And they didn't know what to do with that. So they pushed me out, gently, politely, and completely. For weeks afterward, I drifted. My name was still on the building, but my soul had been boxed up with my office belongings. The company moved on like I had never existed. New slogans, new hires, new direction, and I let them. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't fire, it's stillness. It's letting those who believe they've outgrown you forget one small detail. The roots never shout, they just wait. And when the storm hits, they're the only thing holding the whole structure together. The day I packed my office was the first time I truly felt like a stranger in my own creation. I arrived early, before the elevators filled with startup energy and too loud laughter, before the coffee machines hissed their greetings and the screens blinked awake. I wanted quiet, not out of bitterness, but because I needed the goodbye no one else was willing to give. The office hadn't changed much since I first moved in. Same worn chair, same scratches on the desk from when we dragged it in during a rainy night. Laughing, soaked, delirious with hope. Same photo of the team's first product launch. Younger faces, raw ambition, eyes too bright to know how hard it would really be. Only now something was missing. My portrait. It had hung on the wall behind my desk. Not for pride, but for story. It was taken the day we broke even, the day I told the team, we did it. We're not just surviving anymore. Now the frame was gone, not moved, not relocated, just gone. In its place, a blank patch of wall, no explanation, just erasure. I opened the cabinets. My folders were there, carefully labeled, perfectly aligned, untouched. Strategy drafts, old pitch decks, product notes written longhand on hotel stationery from red-eye flights across continents. Decade-long architecture of a vision they now called outdated. On the filing cabinet was a small note. Someone had written, "Archived per new compliance guidelines." No signature, no warmth, as if legacy belonged in a storage box now. One by one, I packed my things. Notebooks no one read anymore. A pen I was gifted the day we landed our first Series A. The mug my daughter gave me that said, "Part's one boss," faded from use, but still warm with memory. No one came by. No knock on the door. No farewell lunch, no thanks. Just the sound of chairs rolling, phones ringing, and the future moving on without even glancing back. I paused once, holding a small wooden paperweight I had carved myself during the company's 3rd year. I remember staying late in those days, not because I had to, but because I loved it. Because every corner of this office, every whiteboard scribble, every chipped tile was a piece of me. But now I was just another item on the exit list. I took one last look around, not to memorize it. No, that place was already etched into me, but to honor it, to say goodbye not to the walls, but to the man I was when I first walked into them. There's something haunting about leaving a space that no longer remembers you. Something cold about being reduced to a keycard deactivation and a forwarded email. I walked to the elevator with my box in my arms and a quiet resolve in my chest. No parade, no ceremony, not even a nod from the receptionist who used to bring me tea during long meetings. And as the door slid shut behind me, I felt it fully. They hadn't just let me go. They had erased me. Not loudly, not cruelly, but entirely. And yet as the elevator descended, something inside me rose. Because what they failed to understand is this. You can clear a nameplate, you can paint over walls, you can even archive the man's work, but you cannot erase what he taught you while you were watching. And whether they wanted to admit it or not, every brick of that empire still whispered my name. It was strange how grief could feel familiar. I didn't go home after leaving the office. I wandered instead, letting the streets guide me without direction. My hands still carried the weight of that cardboard box, though it now sat in the trunk of my car. What I carried wasn't paper or keepsakes. It was something heavier, a silence that pressed down on the ribs, that tightened the throat just enough to remind you, you're not wanted there anymore. My feet eventually brought me to the old cafe on 8th, the one with the chipped marble counters and mismatched chairs, where we used to celebrate every small win, where we first toasted our first profitable quarter with cheap champagne and coffee-stained napkins, where I once sat with Liam and sketched the future of the company on the back of a receipt. Back then it was just 4 of us, tired, young, wide-eyed. We had nothing but ideas and debt, but that tiny table by the window had held more hope than 1,000 boardrooms. Now I stepped inside and none of the baristas recognized me. New staff, new faces, The only thing that remained was the old menu board and the cracked tile beneath the third stool. Mine. I took that same seat, ordered the same thing, black coffee, no sugar, slightly burnt toast. It tasted the same, but everything else felt hollow. Around me, laughter filled the room, loud, unfiltered, alive. At the corner table, a group of young professionals crowded together over laptops and mock-ups. They spoke in the same eager tones we once did, bursting with acronyms, urgency, and dreams they were convinced no one had dared to dream before. They didn't notice me at first. Why would they? I was just a man alone at a table, in a worn coat, with hands that looked like they'd typed too many things no one reads anymore. But then I caught part of their conversation. One of them was bragging about their latest pitch, about how their new tech would leave the old guard in the dust. And then I heard it, a line tossed out with a laugh. These dinosaurs still think emails and loyalty build companies. I bet half of them still use printers. Look at that guy over there. Probably writes memos by hand. They were talking about me. No malice, just youth, just blindness. I didn't turn. I didn't react. I just looked down at my hands, the same hands that once soldered the prototype of our first product. The same hands that shook on deals across 3 continents. The same hands that steadied younger ones during panic attacks before big launches. The same hands that signed the checks they now cash so easily. And I realized they didn't know what I had done, because no one had told them. That was the true erasure, not just from roles and rooms, but from memory. My story had ended in their world before it had even begun. I finished my coffee in silence, letting the noise blur into the background, letting their words settle not as wounds, but as fuel, because there's something powerful about being underestimated, about being mistaken for someone small when you've once built something vast. They saw a man with nothing left to prove, when in truth I had just decided not to prove it to them. I left the cafe without a word, didn't look back. But as I stepped out into the street, into the cold and fading light, I made myself a quiet promise. You don't teach the world your worth by explaining it. You show them. And when I do, they'll remember who I am. Not because I forced them to, but because they'll have no other choice. That night I didn't sleep. The house was dark, but my mind burned with a light that refused to dim. I sat at the same desk where years ago I had drawn up our first licensing agreement, where I once held my newborn daughter in one arm while drafting our very first patent with the other. That desk had seen sleepless nights of hope. Tonight it would see something else entirely. I opened the old metal filing cabinet. It groaned like it hadn't been touched in years. Dust clung to the corners. Folders, thick with ink and time, waited quietly for my hands. I didn't need to read the labels. I remembered where everything lived. My fingers found the contracts by instinct, muscle memory built over years of protecting what mattered most. Clause by clause, page by page, I read, and with every word I felt something shift inside me. What they called outdated was the very bedrock of everything they stood on. The security protocols they still used, drafted by me after we survived a data breach in year 3, the vendor contracts that gave them unbeatable rates, negotiated during a recession, secured with favors and friendships they didn't even know existed, the original software architecture they now dressed up in prettier skins. My fingerprints were still all over it. And then there were the ownership clauses. I had written those when the company was worth barely 6 figures. Back then I had been so protective, paranoid even, that I embedded fallback provisions no one had cared about. Legal safety nets woven deep into the roots of our partnerships, like anchors in case everything failed. But now those anchors were leverage, because the old man who didn't get it anymore still held veto power over 2 core suppliers. He still held 12% equity in a spin-off company they relied on for logistics. He still owned dormant patents that, when activated, would block the expansion they were pitching so confidently to new investors. They didn't know, because they never asked, because they never thought I mattered enough to check. And suddenly the quiet pain that had followed me for weeks began to morph. Not into vengeance, not into ego, but into clarity. They had pushed me aside, assuming I was empty, assuming my silence was surrender. But I hadn't been sleeping. I'd been watching. And now, as I sat among the wreckage of memory and blueprints, I realized just how much they'd left unguarded. They were so busy racing forward, they never looked back to see who still held the keys. I didn't need to destroy them. That wasn't the point. But I could build something new, something cleaner, leaner, not to compete, but to remind them what real foundations are made of. Not jargon, not youth, not trendy logos and empty launches, but grit, wisdom, loyalty, blood, and the kind of fire that doesn't flicker when the winds change. By dawn, my table was covered in notes, contracts marked, connections mapped, timelines drawn. My hands were ink-stained, my heart steady. They had taken my title, but I still had my name. And before this was over, they would remember exactly who built the ground beneath their feet. It's easy to ignore the fine print, especially when the ink is old and the success feels new. But I remembered every word, not because I had to, but because I wrote them. Not just as a businessman, but as a father, a builder, a man who knew that someday the people who smiled at your table might try to eat without you. And so I had prepared. Late at night, long before investors came and titles were polished, I had studied. Law books stacked beside bottles of black coffee. Contracts from failed companies spread across my desk like autopsy reports. I made notes in margins like prayers. I wasn't just protecting an idea. I was preparing for a future where I might have to protect myself from the very people I once nurtured. And now, sitting in the golden hush of early morning, I was grateful for that obsession. Buried in the stack of archived agreements were the clauses they never bothered to read. Legacy clauses, emergency rights, reversion terms, ownership pivots disguised as boilerplate language. I remembered the laughter from our first legal meeting. "Daniel, no one's ever going to use half of this stuff." "I know," I had said. "That's why it has to be there." And now that forgotten language was my sword. Clause 18b, approval rights over intellectual property licensing. Clause 22c, founding partner retains veto power over liquidation of core tech assets. Clause 90s, in the event of leadership restructuring without unanimous consent, advisory rights remain active for a period of no less than 7 years. They thought removing me from the CEO position was the end of my story. But I hadn't just started a company. I had built its skeleton, its spine. I was in the bones of it. In every clause, every comma they skipped over. They had changed the face of the company. But the frame, the structure, still mine. And structures don't fall just because someone paints the walls a different color. I spent the next week revisiting every agreement. I spoke to people they hadn't contacted in years, suppliers, distributors, early partners who still answered my calls because they remembered, people whose trust wasn't built on trend forecasts, but on broken bread and kept promises. One of them, an old friend from our first logistics contract, laughed when I explained the situation. "You're still holding the hinges, aren't you?" I smiled. "No, I'm holding the blueprint." Because they forgot something vital. I wasn't just the man who signed the checks. I was the one who drew the door. They could close it all they wanted, but they'd never understand how it was built well enough to keep it closed for long. There's a difference between running a company and knowing it, between managing growth and designing it from the ground up. They wore suits and talked about scalability. I knew where the wires ran, where the cracks would form under pressure, where the supports could give way with just the right amount of silence. And I wasn't here to burn the house down. I was here to remind them who laid the first brick. They thought the past was dead weight, but now they would learn what happens when the foundation awakens, because I was never just the founder. I was the architect, and I still had the key. They thought I walked away. They thought the man who once worked 70-hour weeks to keep the lights on had finally grown tired, packed up his pride, and faded into the background, like a thank you note on a forgotten shelf. But I hadn't left. I had simply lowered my voice. The day after I confirmed the last of the legacy clauses, I made the first move. Quiet, precise, no noise, no press releases, just a phone call to a man I once helped escape bankruptcy by giving him an advance when he had nothing but hope and an old van full of broken equipment. He now ran one of their smaller but critical suppliers. His company printed their packaging at cost, and delivered under tight timelines others couldn't meet. I didn't ask for favors, I offered partnership. He said yes before I could finish the sentence. From there, the dominoes began to fall, slowly, elegantly. I sold off a portion of my shares in the main company, but only what was visible, only what would signal resignation to the outside world, a clean exit, the final bow of the old guard. But behind that curtain, I was doing something else. I began acquiring equity in their periphery. Tiny companies, quiet vendors, logistic arms, startups they didn't even realize their survival depended on. I moved through holding firms, shells, former colleagues who now ran lean, brilliant operations that powered the unseen heartbeat of the machine they claimed as theirs. I didn't seek control. I sought influence, not the kind you post on social media, but the kind that makes decisions before meetings are even scheduled. The kind that lives in contract renewals and material supply codes and back-end API agreements. I knew their system better than they did, because I built it. I knew which packaging lines were single source, which server farms they leaned on when traffic spiked. I knew who controlled the freight lanes during holiday chaos. I knew who they'd call in a crisis, and I made sure I was sitting in every one of those rooms, just not as myself. They never saw the pattern, because people blinded by ambition rarely look down, and so they bragged, publicly, announced a new product line, promised same-day delivery in 4 more cities, boasted about lowered costs, higher margins, tighter turnarounds, but I watched from a distance as they moved their chess pieces, and I quietly bought the board. Their silence toward me had been strategic. Now mine was surgical. I didn't want revenge, not really. I didn't want chaos. I wanted clarity. I wanted them to understand, one day soon and without warning, that you can't amputate a foundation and expect the building to keep standing. They had taken everything above ground, the lights, the glass, the glossy brochures and keynote stages. But they forgot one thing. You don't win by standing in the spotlight. You win by controlling the wiring beneath the stage. And I was already there, waiting, watching, not for applause, but for the moment they'd realize the man they buried beneath their ego was already pulling the strings. The world doesn't end when they push you out. Sometimes it begins again, quieter, slower, deeper. I didn't start with capital or headlines. I started with memory. I went back through old emails, late-night thank you messages, resumes that once landed on my desk and were overlooked by the more strategic team. I remembered faces, tired, brilliant, eager, but too unconventional, too raw for the shine our company had started to chase. I reached out to them, not with promises, not with contracts or hype or big talk, just truth. I told them I wasn't trying to rebuild what we had lost. I was trying to build something we never had the courage to create the first time. Something honest. Something lean. Something that didn't trade soul for scale. One by one they came. A programmer who once wrote the most stable code we ever deployed, only to be replaced by someone who presented better in meetings. A designer who could capture emotion in pixels, but was told her style was too subtle for mass appeal. An engineer who'd been laid off during budget cuts, even though he knew the hardware better than anyone else. They weren't polished. They weren't loud, but they cared. And that's all I needed. We worked in a space above an old bookstore, no glass walls, no espresso machines, just desks, the sound of fingers on keyboards and that quiet hum, the one you only hear when people are building something real. There were no brainstorming sessions filled with buzzwords, no TED Talk quotes on the wall, just people, bruised but burning, tired of pretending, ready to work. We didn't start with a launch. We started with a wound, and in that wound we planted fire, not to burn the past, but to light something new. We didn't need venture capital. I funded it myself, not from ego, but because I believed, and because I remembered what it felt like when someone believed in me before I had a title. Every night I stayed later than I should have, not because I had to, but because I wanted to, because I felt it again, the thrum of creation, not performance. There's a difference between chasing numbers and building value. One leaves you empty. The other keeps you up at night, not from anxiety, but from passion too heavy to put down. We built quietly, launched quietly, grew quietly. Because real fire doesn't scream, it just burns. And I watched this small team, this collection of rejects, overlooked talents, forgotten sparks, create something sharper, faster, more human than anything the company I once built could dream of now. Because where they had become too big to bend, we had become too hungry to stop. We didn't try to beat them at their game, we just stopped playing it. And in that shift, something powerful happened. We weren't trying to prove anything anymore. We were simply becoming everything they said we couldn't be. And the best part? They still didn't see it coming. But they would, soon. It began like all downfalls do, not with an explosion, but with a hum. A slow, uneasy murmur that crawled through their polished offices and didn't leave. At first it was delays. Their shipments arrived late. Packages that were once there before sunrise now stumbled in after dark. Customers started to complain, not loudly, just enough for someone in operations to take note and mark it low priority. But the notes kept coming. Then came the investor hesitations. Nothing dramatic, just subtle reschedules. Unanswered emails, meetings pushed indefinitely. A few partners pulled out of upcoming projects, citing market conditions. No one panicked, of course. They had learned to dress fear in strategy. But fear had already moved in. Internally, questions swirled. Why were vendors under-delivering? Why were cloud costs creeping up? Why was user retention dropping even though marketing spend had tripled? They looked outward, as they always had. Blamed the economy, shifts in trends, logistical black swans. They formed committees, sent memos, redesigned dashboards. But the real reason was simple. They had built their empire on borrowed trust, and now the creditors had come home. The vendors I now quietly held majority stakes in had slowly shifted. Slight policy changes here, stricter payment terms there, exclusive commitments to new ventures written in the fine print. Not hostile, not loud, just precise, lawful, and final. I never asked them to sabotage. I only asked them to choose between the company that once treated them like tools and the founder who had once sat in their warehouses, sleeves rolled up, helping load trucks when drivers quit at midnight. They chose me, because people don't follow logos. They follow memory. And while they scrambled to make sense of the crumbling machine, I watched from afar as our small team, my team, began to glow. No press, no influencers, no hype. Just product, just word of mouth, just result. What we had built in silence began to sing. The users stayed. The clients smiled. The reviews appeared, unprompted, raw and grateful. We weren't stealing attention. We were earning loyalty. And the investors? The ones who once ghosted me in glass conference rooms? They started reaching out again. One even messaged, pretending not to recognize our product as mine. Impressive pivot. Who's behind this? I didn't reply, because I didn't need to. Every line of code, every user interaction, every glowing testimonial was a fingerprint. Mine, ours, real. And somewhere behind thick glass and falling stock reports, the people who once erased me had begun to feel it too. They couldn't trace the problem because they didn't know what they'd broken. They didn't understand that value isn't just built, it's remembered. And I had never stopped remembering. Not the names, not the late nights, not the promises. And now, 1 year later, while they held emergency meetings and whispered about restructuring, I stood in a room full of engineers, designers, thinkers, doers. No titles, just brilliance. And I smiled, because we weren't a company. We were a cause, and causes don't crumble under pressure. They rise, one quiet, earned victory at a time. I hadn't planned on attending. The invitation came folded in a thick white envelope, gold-trimmed, addressed not to my old company, not to Daniel Reed, founder, but to a name no one in the public world had yet connected to me, the new venture's quiet brand, now whispering loudly through the industry. It was a nomination. Breakthrough Company of the Year. The irony wasn't lost on me. I stared at the card for a long time, not out of disbelief, but because something in me stirred, not pride, not vengeance, peace. It had been over a year since I was escorted out of my own boardroom like a guest who had overstayed his welcome, since they labeled me obsolete, since they laughed behind walls I'd helped build. And now the stage they had once promised to newer, younger voices had unexpectedly turned in my direction again. I arrived without an entourage. No assistant, no camera crew, no speech in hand. Just me, in a dark suit older than some of the finalists, walking through a lobby lit with ambition and perfume. The room buzzed, glasses clinked, names floated, and then, moments before the program began, I saw them. The executive team from my former company, dressed sharp, faces tense, hands tucked into pockets with the stiffness of people unsure of what they'd hear next. They hadn't recognized me yet. I took my seat somewhere near the middle, not in the spotlight, but not hiding either. I didn't need to hide, not anymore. I had nothing to prove. When they announced the award, the room dimmed. A spotlight cut across the stage. The announcer listed achievements, metrics, partnerships, growth numbers, none of which mattered to me as much as the faces now slowly turning toward mine, stunned, wide-eyed. When the name was read aloud, it didn't come with a gasp. It came with a pause, a ripple of recognition. I stood slowly. Their eyes were on me now, the ones who had taken my name off the wall, who said I didn't belong in the future, who assumed I would wither in the past. I walked to the stage steady, calm. Each step felt heavier, not with burden, but with meaning, because I wasn't just walking for the award. I was walking for every sleepless night, every unspoken insult, every time they had looked through me and seen only a shadow. I took the plaque with both hands. It was polished, beautiful, but it wasn't the award that made the moment sacred. It was the silence in the room, the unspoken realization. They knew, not just who I was, but what I had done, and what they had thrown away. I didn't make a speech. The room expected one, but I let the silence speak louder than applause. I looked out at the audience, found their eyes in the crowd, their pale, rigid expressions, and I smiled. Not with triumph, but with grace, because the man they once erased had built something again, not in spite of their betrayal, but because of it. I walked off the stage to applause that wasn't just loud, it was honest. And for the first time in years, I felt my name settle back into my chest. Not as a title, not as a role, but as a man, whole again. It was a quarterly earnings call like any other. At least that's what they thought. Their boardroom was filled with tension, not because anything had gone catastrophically wrong, but because nothing had gone noticeably right in months. Growth had slowed, margins were tightening. The once certain confidence that used to float around their forecasts had deflated into something brittle, like glass under pressure. But they still gathered in that room like they used to when I was in charge. Backs straight, ties tight, screens flickering with metrics and graphs. They still used the language we once built together. They still echoed the strategies I had carved in the leanest years of our infancy. They just no longer remembered where those words came from. That day, one of the senior analysts, an external but well-respected voice in the investment community, presented a list of top-growing companies in our sector. A routine segment, comparative performance, emerging players, potential threats. But when the slide changed, the air changed with it. A logo they didn't recognize appeared on the screen. Clean, minimal, sharp. My company's name, and below it a number, stark, unapologetic. Net worth, $320 million. The room stopped breathing. It wasn't the number itself. They had seen 9-figure valuations before. It was how fast it had arrived. The velocity, the momentum, the silence with which it had grown under their noses, while they were too busy rehearsing taglines and chasing headlines. Then someone said it, softly, like a ghost had passed through the room. "Wait, isn't that him?" Silence followed. One of the junior investors, newer to the table, leaned forward with wide eyes. He wasn't part of the old battles. He didn't know the story, but he recognized the shape of something powerful. He whispered to no one in particular. "He used to be here, right?" The CFO's hand trembled slightly as he moved to the next slide, pretending not to hear. But the damage was done, because the room knew, the walls remembered, and even the glass reflected back the truth they had tried to erase. The founder they had removed was now their biggest competitor. Except I wasn't competing. Not really. I hadn't built my company to spite them. I had built it to prove something true. That soul still had a place in strategy. that care could scale. That loyalty, when poured into the right soil, could grow something they could never predict, never control, never own. That earnings call went on, but no one was listening anymore. They were all still staring at that number. 320 million. But what made them pale wasn't the size of the valuation. It was the realization that I had reached it without them. No boardroom politics, no branding consultants, no applause, just grit, trust, and a team of people who had once been told they weren't enough. And now we were more than enough. We were undeniable. That moment rippled far beyond their walls. Calls were made, analysts scrambled, news articles began to surface. Who was behind this rising star? The quiet company disrupting the old guard, built-in silence, now making noise. I watched it all unfold from my home office. No celebration, just stillness. Because this wasn't a victory lap. It was a reckoning. I had been pushed aside, archived, forgotten. But the moment they saw that number, one thing became certain. They would never forget me again. It came late in the evening, the kind of evening where everything felt still, where the sky held that heavy silver silence just before rain. I was at my desk, not working, just sitting, thinking, letting the quiet surround me the way it hadn't in years, a quiet not born from exhaustion or exile, but from peace. Earned peace. That's when my phone buzzed. A message, short and formal. "Sir, would you be willing to meet? We need to talk. We were wrong." No sender name. Just a number I had once known by heart. The kind of number I used to call instinctively at any hour because the person on the other end once sat beside me building the future. I stared at the screen. There was no anger in me anymore. No desire to call and rage, to demand anything, to ask why it took them so long. That fire had long since cooled into something heavier, more solid, self-respect. Their message wasn't an olive branch, it was a life raft. I recognized the tone. I knew the rhythm of people who wanted to be seen as humble only after they had run out of reasons to be proud. But what struck me most wasn't the content of the message. It was how late it came. After the silence, after the exile, after the smirks and whispers and backroom meetings I was never invited to. They had waited until the world changed, until the balance shifted, until the number on the screen could no longer be ignored. They waited not because they saw my worth, but because now others did. And that wasn't an apology. That was survival. I didn't open the message, not out of cruelty, but because I had already given them my answer once, long ago, in loyalty and sacrifice, in late nights and early mornings and hands that held a crumbling company together. They hadn't just betrayed me in business. They had betrayed the version of me that believed we were building something sacred. And when they let that version fall, they didn't just lose a CEO. They lost the right to call themselves part of my story. Now they wanted a conversation. But conversations require respect. And theirs had expired long before the ink on my exit papers had dried. I set the phone down. The screen dimmed. And in that small act, I felt something lift. Because forgiveness isn't always about saying yes. Sometimes forgiveness is not needing the apology at all. I had moved on, not with noise, not with vengeance, but with quiet, relentless purpose. I had built something new, something better, something they could no longer reach with titles or strategy or well-crafted regrets. And maybe somewhere in that message, there was sincerity. But sincerity, after loss, is not the same as loyalty before success. They had their chance. They chose pride. And now I chose silence, not as punishment, but as power. Because nothing speaks louder than walking away from the people who only learned to value you once you no longer needed them. And I no longer needed them. Not for validation, not for justice, not even for closure. I had already closed the door. The new office stood at the edge of the city, where the skyline began to breathe again, away from the polished towers of venture-backed noise, far from the streets where reputation was currency and memory was short. It wasn't built to impress. It was built to last. Red brick, brushed steel, wide windows that opened not just to sunlight, but to air. No glass cages, no corner offices, just long tables, open spaces, and quiet rooms where ideas could be born without being immediately priced. It wasn't the kind of place that made headlines. It was the kind that made work. We moved in on a Monday morning, No ribbon cutting, no press. Just the team, my team, carrying chairs, adjusting cables, unpacking boxes filled not with awards or trophies, but notebooks, sketches, pieces of a dream we had all fought to protect when no one else believed in it. There was one wall just inside the entrance, large, bare, deliberate. I hadn't known what to place there, not at first. But as we began to settle in, someone quietly approached me, our youngest developer. She held a frame in her hands, wrapped in cloth. "We made something," she said. When I unwrapped it, I didn't speak. It was a portrait. Not grand, not staged, just real. Me, sitting on the floor, blueprint in hand, eyes focused on something not in the frame, because that's where vision lives, beyond the frame, beyond the now. They had captured me, not as a figure of the past, not as a memory, but as something still moving, still building. Below the portrait was a small engraved line, "The founder of our future." They hung it on the wall that day, together, no speeches, just stillness. And I stood there, watching the light hit the frame as people passed by, new hires, old friends, former interns now leading departments. No one paused out of obligation. They paused because they belonged, because this place had been built for them. And suddenly, I realized something I hadn't dared to admit for years. I had never wanted revenge. Not really. I didn't want to ruin what had been stolen from me. I just wanted to build something that couldn't be taken. And now here it was. Not a company. Not a comeback. But a continuation. This wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about proving that what's built with love, with truth, with purpose, doesn't just survive. It endures. The old office had my name. This one had my values, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had returned. I felt like I had arrived. They had erased my story from their walls. So I built a wall of my own, not as a monument to what I had lost, but as a foundation for everything still to come. That evening, the city breathed slow beneath the soft weight of twilight. The office had quieted, the last light flickering out on the far end of the hall. The hum of progress had faded into a peaceful stillness, the kind that only comes when you know, truly know, that the storm is behind you and something real has taken its place. I stood by the window, hands in my pockets, watching the skyline blink and settle. The same city that once swallowed me whole now looked small beneath my feet. But I didn't feel above it. I felt rooted, centered, not because of power or profit, but because for the first time in decades, I didn't need the world to see me in order to feel seen. Behind me, soft footsteps, familiar. My son, he had grown, in ways only time can measure, not just in height or voice, but in understanding. He wasn't a boy anymore. He had watched this journey unfold not through headlines, but through quiet dinners, long silences, and the tired eyes of a man who refused to give up even when the world turned its back. He stood beside me, mirroring my gaze. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then in a voice just above a whisper, he asked, "Dad, you could have crushed them. Why didn't you?" I didn't look at him right away. I let the question hang in the air, like smoke from a fire long since burned out. And then softly, I nodded. "I could have," I said, "but I would have lost something greater." He waited, eyes searching my face, waiting for more. I could have taken their clients, pulled every string, bought out their silence, turned their legacy into a cautionary tale, and maybe, for a moment, I would have felt like I'd won. I turned to him then. "But what's the point of winning if you become like the ones who tried to destroy you?" He didn't respond. He just listened. "I built something better," I continued. "Not out of spite, but out of belief. I didn't chase revenge. I chose meaning. I didn't want them to kneel. I wanted them to understand." Outside, a soft wind stirred the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, not loudly, but clearly. "Respect," I said quietly, "is worth more than $1 billion valuation, and the people who lost mine will carry that weight longer than I ever carried their betrayal." My son was quiet for a long time. Then, without a word, he stepped closer and rested his hand on my shoulder. And that was enough. That night, I didn't check my stocks, didn't reread the press articles, didn't answer congratulatory emails or return missed calls from people who had once stayed silent. I just stood by the window, watching the city, listening to the silence. And in that silence, I heard something I hadn't heard in years. Peace. Not the peace that comes from applause, but the kind that arrives when your soul stops fighting for permission to be whole. Because I had lost, I had been broken, betrayed, but I had rebuilt, not louder, not higher, just truer. I had taught them something they never understood in all their boardrooms and branding campaigns. That real value isn't measured in metrics. It's measured in the kind of man you become when no one is watching. And now, as the world finally looked back in my direction, I no longer needed their approval. I had my name. I had my purpose. I had peace. And in the stillness of that evening, beside the son who now understood, I finally said the words I had waited years to believe. I did it right.